Scotland is one of those places that seems to never really be simple, or summed up neatly in a couple of words. Sure, you can try, the tourists certainly do. Tartan, booze, and heavy accents. But I've lived here all my life, never worn a tartan, nor drunk. Although I suppose my accent is fairly heavily thick. In reality, it's like most places in the world are nowadays, a strange mix of tradition and striving to be ahead in a modern world. But one thing that truly seems to persist in this country is fear. The fear of the countryside, the hills and the cliffs, the strong currents of the sea, the knowledge that the world out there is a dangerous place. Fear followed us into the towns as well, one of the simplest forms of merely being stabbed by one of the notorious gangs on the East Coast. But after my experience growing up, I would say fear of the countryside persists the most. That old world full of magic and ghouls, so easy to laugh about when sitting at home. But out there, on the moors, it's the type of place that you really can start to believe those old stories. I grew up in the countryside, one of those tucked away houses in the highlands, which, in order to get to, one needed to take the most underused roads possible before turning down a practically hidden track winding deeper into an unkempt forest. In a lot of ways, it was a pretty darn good place to grow up. There was little traffic, so my parents had little worry over the usual city problems. Plenty of room to keep the animals of all sorts, and a vast playground stretching out for miles. There were a few downsides, of course, a long journey to school and back each day, even longer once I moved up to secondary, a pretty crap internet connection once we finally got it, and a temperamental source of electricity, which means we got pretty good at playing board games during power cuts. But one thing that I loved about our house was its location, near the base of a steep hill. You see, my parents were enthusiastic hill walkers, and although when I was little I'd complain about being dragged along, I soon caught the bug for it. All we had to do for a great walk was take the pathway from the back of the house leading uphill and just follow it along. Soon enough, the trees would clear and you'd be left with a pretty fantastic view of the landscape. It was also the type of hill close to several others on one side, the types that would all appear to melt into each other and loom dauntingly, bordering the view from a car window on a long stretch of road heading towards the Iverness. And boy, if you love walking, you'd adore these hills. Of course, my parents were always cautious when I was little. It was definitely the type of place that you wouldn't want a small child wandering around by themselves. But once I got older, I was allowed to go out by myself, promising to stick to the designated path and not go too far. But then, kids never really do listen to their parents, do they? Of course, as I grew even older, my parents became much more lax about the rules, and trusted that I was able to look after myself fairly well on my own. And generally, I had a good experience up on the hillside. I found what I can only really describe as the glory of walking. The feel of being completely isolated and at one with nature, the vastness of everything, the knowledge that the path I was walking had been one that many people many generations ago had taken. But I suppose this story is about a bad experience I had up there. As beautiful as the landscape was, there's another thing about Scotland. The weather is unpredictable as our own tempers. There was one time when I was about 9 years old, I'd grow bored watching television and decide to head out for a walk, taking one of our 3 dogs along with me, Penny, a border collie, and I wandered up along the hillside. I was heading towards this pile of rocks which I'd nicknamed Stonehenge, but was, in reality, most likely an old cairn that had been knocked over and its stones haphazardly scattered. It was a bit off the beaten path, but not too far away from the safety zone. I enjoyed going up there to play about at being a Neanderthal or a tomb opener. The details I can't really remember, but what I do remember is how I was so caught up in my imaginings and play that I didn't realize the weather had taken a turn for the worse, and that a thin veil of mist had set in and it was growing steadily thicker and thicker. I noticed this, and even though I started to feel unsure, I could still see the pathway, so I shrugged it off and carried on playing. The next thing I knew, there was a loud bark from Penny, who I turned to face to see what she had gotten so worked up about. But as I turned, I saw her speeding towards me, her teeth bared. When a dog comes running towards you as though it's about to attack, it's a pretty frightening thing, especially when you're so young. I was frozen, still trying to figure out if I should run when Penny had already jumped up on top of me, toppling me over, and I fell in the gap between the 2 largest stones. Thankfully I didn't crack my head open on the rock, but the tumble was still scary enough and I merely curled up whimpering, convinced that my dog had turned against me and would tear me to shreds. She hovered above me, her teeth inches from my neck, but instead of reaching down, she continued to snarl at something that wasn't me. She barked, and I felt her weight lift from me as she moved off me, furious at something that I couldn't see between my fingers. I stayed very still, and I didn't know for how long, but it felt like an eternity. Finally, she stopped appearing as though she was about to attack and retreated back to me, tentatively licking my face. I gathered up as much bravery as I could muster and got up to my knees before she nudged me away from where she had taken a stance. I stood up and moved towards the path, and Penny stayed close to my side, still not at ease. She relaxed a little when we got to the trodden path, but as I stumbled back along towards home quickly, my legs still brushed up against her side as I took each step. I had a bit of explaining to do to my parents when I came in, but they were so used to me getting a bit dirtied up and scratched when I was playing in the forest. I mentioned how defensive Penny had gotten, but we all ended up just brushing it off, thinking that maybe there had been a stray sheep that she had actually been growling at. The second experience I had was a fair few years later, when I was about 15 years old. It was an age in which I had probably spent the least amount of time outside on walks, as I'd gotten caught up in the world of the internet and was able to communicate with my friends relatively cheaply at home, something which I was greatly excited about. That Saturday, the internet had failed and I'd gotten increasingly angry, taking my frustration out by yelling at my parents about how horrific it was to be so isolated, and in a typical teenage manner stormed out of the house. Knowing that they'd be likely to follow me on the road towards civilization, I headed in the opposite direction and took myself up the hillside. Slowly my frustration diminished as I worked out my anger through my physical exercise, and I found myself almost smiling as I looked out at the view I had not seen in months, having forgotten how glorious walking was. Instead of going back home in a much more reasonable mood, I decided to enjoy the countryside that afternoon and started wandering about the hillside. By that age, I knew the whole area better than most people know their own hometown, and could have figured out my way back home in the middle of the night. I hiked up to the summit of one hill before dipping down and up again to the next summit. As I looked out, I could see the weather was taking a turn for the worst again and headed back home. As I wandered back, a strange combination of mist and a cloud started unfurling itself, obscuring the summit from my view and wafting down the hillside in waves. It was just about then that I started feeling odd. There was a strange sensation, a tingle down my spine, if you'll pardon the cliche, and my steps, although usually strong and steady, felt unsure. I stumbled down the hill as fast as I could before glancing down at the landscape around me that was now partially obscured. It was then that I had the single most terrifying experience of my life. As silly and typical as it sounds, I felt doubt. Doubt over where I was. I mean, I had a vague idea, but I was doubting whether I really was where I thought I was. As I've said before, I knew the hillside so well that to have a moment where I felt unsure was completely alien. I then panicked. Blind panic is one of those things that you feel ashamed of, or don't really understand as a watcher, but it was what I experienced up there. Everything became so silent, and all I could hear was the beating of my heart. My breaths grew ragged and shallow, uneven, inhaling too little, exhaling too much. My childhood world was gone, and it was a place in which I didn't know anything of and would never get out. It's a fairly common occurrence for people to get lost in the highlands. People wander out into the hills, get hurt, and can't get help. People get lost among the heather and then fall into a peat bog, unable to get out. It's a sad truth, but you get used to it. We get a lot of tourists in our area, and they often do go missing. The number of cups of tea that we've served rescue teams is innumerable, and it's sad that we appear to have grown an exterior skin, being a bit insensitive and feeling more that the tourists were a bit dim for getting lost up there and not sticking to the paths. In that moment, though, I genuinely believed I wasn't going to get home. I broke down and ran. It didn't really matter that tears were obscuring my vision or that the misty clouds had grown thicker than ever and that I had no idea where I was running. I just ran as damn well hard as I could. I wasn't going to be someone who would curl up into a little ball and freeze to death. And for that reason, I just hoped as long as I ran downhill for long enough, I'd reach some form of civilization again. But that depended entirely on which hill I was on. I stumbled along down, trying hard not to fall, although I'm sure I twisted my ankle by plowing through an uneven terrain until finally I did fall down. I screamed, a true, completely uncontrollable scream as I fell to the ground hard. I banged my face on something hard and cried out in agony. I felt my face and cringed to find warm, sticky substance on my face. I wiped it away as best I could and squinted hard to see what I had fallen on. I almost cried for joy when I realized that I had tripped over one of the rogue rocks of Stonehenge. It was a relief to know that I was at a well-visited landmark of mine and had the instructions on how to get home, and those were carved into my mind. Although it's a bit pathetic to admit this, I crawled to the path and cried with relief when I reached it. I continued crawling for a good part of the way, just too scared to get up and see the world closed off around me. With the mist pressing in from all sides, I eventually managed to stand up again once I'd reached the muddier path of the forest. My parents were worried sick when I got back in, and quickly drove me to the hospital. My wounds weren't too bad, but I'd lost a lot of blood as the cut on my head was pretty large, so it got stitched up. I shakily managed to tell my parents that I just panicked, ended up running and tripped. It could have easily been chalked up to nerves, or the fact that I really hadn't been walking up there in a few months. But I felt in my heart it was something deeper than that. There had been an instinctive part of me that had felt wrong, and I thought I wouldn't dare admit this to anyone. I hadn't been alone in the hill. It hadn't been just bad weather. It had been this strange sort of mist that had either fogged my brain or had been trying to draw me into it. After that incident, I wouldn't go walking up in the hill by myself, and I always made sure I at least brought my dog along. I was simply too shaken up. But it didn't completely deter me from enjoying the splendors of the hills. The final time I went walking into the hills was about a year after the last incident, so I was about 16. I was starting to feel a lot better about what had happened, and I began to rationalize it in my head. One of my closer friends had come over for the weekend, and we had spent our first night staying up late, stuffing our faces and munching away on whatever food we could find in the cupboard. The next day, though, our entertainment was wearing thin, and we decided to get out and about for a bit. Unfortunately, having woken up late, we missed the ride into the closest village with my mom. And instead of taking the trek down to the bus stop, we decided to just do a walk nearby and set off up the hill. We laughed and jested, and I showed my friend Leslie the place where I cracked my head open, as well as the cairn on the top of the hill, and we spent a good couple hours simply wandering slowly around the hillsides. Again, we lost track of time a bit, and it was starting to look a bit dim, so we started to head back home. A mist had settled in, and the whole place felt as if I had been 15, a bit disoriented. However, I took deep breaths, controlling my emotions, and continued on in a calm manner. After a while, Leslie started to worry a bit aloud. "Are you sure we're heading in the right direction?" "Yes," I replied confidently, trying to keep my voice assured. There was a pause as we walked in silence for 5 more minutes. "How come it's taking so long?" Leslie moaned. "Are you sure you know where we are?" I nodded. "How can you even tell in this?" My friend gestured around at the white landscape. I didn't really know how to answer that. I was just using my gut instinct. I could have pointed out a couple rock shapes that we'd been passing that I knew well, but I doubt it would have seemed very convincing. Leslie knew that I had gotten lost up here once before, and evidently that was casting doubt on the accuracy of my judgment. I looked around and realized for the first time how blindingly white it all seemed. It was then that I saw something else in the mist. Glancing back at Leslie, I saw that my companion had seen the figure too. It was hard to properly see, but it definitely looked like someone else had gotten caught in this ridiculous weather as well. Some poor bugger was stumbling around lost. I sighed and was just about to say I was going to fetch them and take them back with us when Leslie spoke first. "Look, why don't we ask them for directions?" I choked back a laugh. Somehow I don't think they're going to be the best help. It's probably just some tourist." She looked at me incredulously. "What are you talking about? They look a damn lot more sure of themselves than we do." I glanced back at the figure, which appeared to have fallen down, confused. "Look, come on, before he goes," Leslie started off towards the figure. "No!" I grabbed her arm. "What?" I spoke in an urgent whisper. "The thing over there, it's standing up?" Leslie looked at it before turning back and rolling her eyes. "Yes?" I looked over the figure that was now definitely on the ground, fumbling around. "We should go. Now." "What?" I lowered my voice. "Now step back, slowly." "Oh, for Christ's sakes," Look, I'll just be a minute to go ask this guy if we're headed in the right direction, okay? I shook my head, but she prized her arm from my grasp, made a face at me, and wandered off towards the figure. I watched her go as she and the figure faded slowly from my view. I waited for 10 minutes, then went home. When I got home, I told my parents that Leslie and I had gotten separated, and a search team was called. I wasn't entirely sure whether I should mention the figure we'd seen, hard to make out by both of us, but with such differing behaviors. But I told the police when they came back to interview me. I doubt they took me seriously, what with the fact that I had bad experiences before, and probably concluded that I had some hallucination of some sort. After all, a lot of people go up. Not everyone comes down. It's a sad, unfortunate truth. But now looking back, I'm not so sure it's as simple as that. Of course, accidents happen, but I can't help but remember those 3 incidents. The same pricking of hairs against my shirt, the same feeling of the mist pressing in around me, the same nagging that something wasn't quite right. You see, the figure was 2 things at once. From my perspective, I saw a lost tourist, some poor bugger who had strayed from the path and not gotten back before becoming completely disoriented. Leslie claimed to have seen someone who was so sure of themselves, someone to ask for help. We both saw something that we were attracted to approach. I didn't, and Leslie did. They never found Leslie. After that day, I never went walking in those hills again. Now I've moved away and in my final year of university in Aberdeen. Glad to have moved on with my life. There have been times that I've been out with my mates to the pub and come across a group of tourists just heading north. They often ask a few of us about the highlands and for any stories. Sometimes they even ask us directly about mythical creatures such as Loch Ness Monster or about the Fae. Then I'll tell them my story. Normally they'll nod and listen politely enough. All my friends jeer away at me for trying to wind the tourists up or being a bit soft in the head believing in fairies and things like that. But there are a few times after I laugh off the teasing that I catch someone's eyes. Whether they be someone I share a mutual friend with but don't really know well, or a quiet drinker at a bar listening in to our conversation. Someone who, themselves, have lived outside the cities. We share just for a moment an understanding. Alright, thank you guys for watching. I appreciate it. If you enjoyed, leaving a like would be great, and subbing is a great way to stay up to date on what I post. Alright, so I'm trying to kind of hone in the monetization with this. I think I'm probably just putting I don't know. I'm not trying to put ads in the middle of the story, because someone mentioned that it does affect the flow. So these are just going to be continuously read stories so it doesn't break. Alright, I appreciate you guys watching, like I said, and I will see y'all in the next one.